Hi guys, as Divya said, my name's CJ Gammon. I'm on the web platform team at Adobe. And the title of my talk is Digital Reading Experiences, or Do Androids Read Electric Books? And this title actually comes from the Philip K. Dick novel. Any sci-fi fans in the house? Okay, cool, awesome. This comes from his book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is a science fiction novel taking place in the future, dealing with themes of the human experience. But what I want to talk about is the reading experience and how that applies to the web and where we see this going in the future. So before I begin, I want to take a step back and think about what it is we're doing when we're reading. And I really like this quote from Aristotle that says, "Spoken words are the symbols of mental experience, and written words are the symbols of spoken words." Because I think it reminds us that what we're doing when we're reading is actually engaging in experiences and ideas, and the written word is a way of sharing and archiving information for future generations. And this is something that's fundamental to society and culture. So when we think about reading experiences, before computers and all our different devices came about, we were primarily talking about print. And print is a pretty mature medium, and there are a lot of different genres that we have with it. We've got things like comic books, novels, magazines, newspapers, and the list goes on. But when we think about, when we go beyond print, sorry. When we go beyond print to the web, what we're dealing with is a relatively young medium. And while we're probably not really used to thinking of it that way, it's really not been around that long relative to print. So in the beginning, like any new medium, the focus was on what it was really good at, which was sharing information and not so much creating that optimal reading experience. So we've come a long way since then, and what I want to talk about now are some things we can do in the web today and some ways that we can optimize our reading experiences on the web. So these are just some rules of thumb that you can apply to your reading content on the web. These might not apply to every web app or every website you're making, but when your focus is on creating an optimal reading experience, these should come in handy. So the first one is your font. There are a ton of great resources out there for using web fonts today. Things like Edge Web Fonts, Google Web Fonts, Typekit, and many more. And you can all use these to make your reading experiences that much more engaging and powerful. You don't want to rely on the browser for font styles, things like bold and italics. You want to make sure that these are included in the font family you're using, whether you're using one of these services or using @FontFace. You want to make sure that this is specified. Otherwise, you can get unexpected results when you're bolding a font that may already be bolded or just have unwanted results. You also don't want to overwhelm the user with fonts, because this can cause what I like to call the ransom note effect, which basically, it's distracting to the reader and they have a hard time concentrating on your content because there's so many different things going on the page. You also want to use high contrast when using multiple fonts. So for example, I may want to use a sans serif bold font for my header and a serif font for my body copy, and this will communicate to the reader that there are differences between these types of content within my page. So font size is really important for readability. I recommend you use the default font size for long readable content. Now, this is going to default to 16 pixels in the browser, and it'll respect whatever the user adjusts their default font size to. But this may seem large, but there's actually a great article by Information Architects where they compare the eye distance from a screen when reading to the eye distance from a page when a user's reading, and these sizes are actually quite comparable to 16 pixels. So the eye distance is a factor. You also want to make sure you're sizing with relative font units. Hopefully you're already doing this, but Ems have been long recommended font size unit for sizing your font. We also now have REMs, which are awesome. So the issue with Ems, if you're not familiar, is they actually, the single unit represents the current font size, or the font size of the parent and container. And this can get tricky, and you have to reset your font size to get cohesive and consistent units. But if you use REMs, what this does is it looks at the root element for the font size. So you always have a consistent unit of measurement throughout the page that the REM is referencing. And I'll show you an example of how that works really quick. So if you can see here, I've got 3 different blocks, and they're all containing different text, or text using different units. And as I resize the root, the M and the REM, my responsive units, are changing their values because they're inheriting the value. But if I change the container, only the M is changing value because it's looking at the parent for its value. So this is really nice because it means that the REM has 1 point of reference. Another important factor is contrast. You want to make sure that there's enough contrast that your reader can actually read the content on your page. And there's actually a specific contrast ratio that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines specifies. You're probably not going to remember this. I know I don't, but Leah Veru, who's actually speaking next at the conference, has a great tool out there on GitHub where you can compare your foreground and background colors and make sure they fit within this ratio. You also want to avoid pure black and white. You want to remember that when you're dealing with pixels, you're typically dealing with light. And so pure black and white can have too high of a contrast and be wearing on the eyes. So this is my awesome slide. You can see I have the word awesome written twice. The thing I want to point out here is if you look at the word and the spacing between the letters, this is referred to as kerning. The first word is the way the font layouts on the page by default. And there's actually extra spacing between the A and the W. So what I've done with the second word is I've adjusted the kerning here so that the spacing is more consistent with the rest of the letters. And this is especially important for large header copy where people are going to actually notice this difference. But what I can do is I can just adjust the kerning there so that it's more consistent and more easy on the eyes. So tracking and kerning. With tracking, we deal with letter spacing. When you have small condensed fonts, you want to increase the letter spacing or tracking just to make it more legible and easier to read. There's also, in the font module level 3, there's a font kerning property that can be set to normal. I don't believe this has any implementations yet, but the way this is going to work is it's actually going to use kerning data within the font so that certain characters, when combined with each other, will use kerning adjustments when you set it to normal instead of the default. There's also a JavaScript library called lettering.js, which will allow you to manually adjust the kerning of your letters so that you can get that perfect kerning and that perfect spacing between the letters. You want to be careful when you use this. I recommend using it only for header copy because what it's actually doing is wrapping all the elements in span tags and letting you manually position them. So use it sparingly. So some other concepts that are really important for readability are the measure and leading. So measure is actually the distance or the length of the line or the column. And you can see here, you want to make sure you have a comfortable column length. If I extend my column too wide, it can be difficult to track the next line. So you can see here, the distance between the first line and the second line is so far that sometimes the reader will lose track of which line they're on and have to backtrack, and this can be distracting. And you really want them to be able to concentrate on your content. And if I make it too short, they're tracking it too frequently, and this can be distracting as well. So I want to keep a comfortable length. Also, my leading can affect this as well. So I can increase my leading to make it easier to track the next line. I can also, if I decrease the leading and it gets too tight, it's hard for the user to focus on one line at a time. So this is undesirable. So you want to make sure that your leading is good so they can focus on one line at a time and that your measure is a comfortable length. And as your measure gets longer, you can also increase your leading so that it's easier for them to track that next line. So for leading, we use line height. It's a good starting point is 1.5 or 150% for line height. This will make sure that you have enough padding between lines that the reader can concentrate on one line at a time. For measure, the range of 45 to 75 characters is pretty safe, so you want to stay within that range somewhere. And the important thing here is that we're talking about characters, so it's actually relative to the font size. So if you increase the font size, this would increase as well. So some other things that we can bring over from previous reading experiences are justification, which is actually the spacing between words in a line. And with justification, what we get are nice, solid column edges. So here, if I apply justification to this text, you can see my left and right columns are perfectly aligned with each other. And this can be pleasing on the eyes. The problem here, though, is that justification can also cause white space and rivers of white space within text. If you look at the first line here, there are a number of spots where you see excess white space, and it's inconsistent with the other lines within that block. And I also have these rivers of white space that sort of cause and break up the content, which can be distracting to the reader. So a solution for this is you can apply hyphenation to your content along with justification. And if you watch here, what this is going to do is actually break up some of these longer words so that my spacing between words will actually be more consistent. So if I apply hyphens to this content, you can see I get a much nicer, solid piece of content. It's easier to read, and the spacing is more consistent between lines. Another thing we can do is apply a text balancing algorithm to the content. If you look at the first line, you can see how the word story in my header wraps to the next line. And this looks a little weird. It just doesn't feel right to a reader. So what I can do is apply a balancing algorithm where it tries to make both of those line lengths even and wraps it. This way I don't have to go through and manually add break points to it when I'm doing responsive designs. So for justification, we have text-align justify, which will apply full justification. We also have hyphens auto in CSS, but the implementation is a little spotty, so there is hyphenator.js, which you can use to apply hyphens to your content. There's also a text balancing algorithm that's being proposed by Randy Edmonds at Adobe, which will allow you to balance your text. While this isn't available yet, there is a jQuery plugin you can use to apply text balancing to try and get consistent lines within your blocks of text. Another interesting thing that's come from past reading experiences to the web is multi-columns. So the way that this works is you have a single block of text filled with copy, and you specify the number of columns you want it to be broken into and the spacing between those columns. You don't see this a lot on the web, and the reason is you want to be careful because when combining this with vertical scrolling, you can have some problems. You don't want the user to have to scroll down a long column and then scroll back up to continue reading the content. That doesn't make sense. So you want to make sure that if you're using this, your columns are short and that you're not creating this problem with scrolling content. So those are some things that we can do on the web today to kind of enhance our experience in reading. So now I want to walk through some things that we can do some things that our team at Adobe is working on to bring new reading experiences to the web. So one of those is regions, and this idea actually comes from desktop publishing tools. If you think of tools like InDesign, where you have a box, and as you're typing in that box, the overflow continues to type into specified boxes. So the idea here is that it separates your content from your layout. So we have this content over here, and what I can do is I can draw some arbitrary blocks on the page and then tell it that I want this content to flow through these boxes. And you can see it automatically just flows through the way I've defined it. And the nice thing about this is it really doesn't care what your layout is. You can be using something like a grid system or Flexbox, and it's automatically going to flow through the blocks that you've defined. So how can we use this? This can be really useful for doing things like magazine-style layouts. Here we have an example of something that's very reminiscent of a magazine, where we've got a full-page bleed photo as the cover and what appears to be multi-columns at the bottom. But if you watch as we continue to scroll down, the column continues down the page, wrapping around this image on the side. So we've got this very magazine-like feel on a web page. And we can also have the content flowing through things like pull quotes within the content. So the important thing to remember here is that all of this content lives in one place. So I don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to flow through each of these elements. All I have to do is edit it in one spot, and I don't have to copy and paste from one div to another if it changes my layout. So, and you can see we can have it flowing through other elements within the page as well. So that's just one cool thing we can do with regions. Another interesting paradigm that this can bring to the web is the concept of pagination. And this is something you don't see too much on the web today. There are some examples with things like slideshows and pagination between separated content. But when you think of the reading experiences you use on your tablet, you're probably using a Kindle or your iPad with iBooks. And for long linear content, people tend to page through that content instead of vertically scrolling, especially for long content. So here you can see we can have something like a novel and page through it, much like we would on our Kindle or iPad. And it's interesting that if you go to read.amazon.com, they're actually doing something like this right now on the web. But regions actually makes it so much simpler because all you have to do is set up these pages and regions and have your content in one location and flow through it instead of managing all the layout with JavaScript. So another interesting thing that we've been able to do in the past is wrap text around shapes or within shapes. And this is really great for creative solutions. And our solve to this is exclusions. So here I have some content that's defined in a shape, and you can see how the content is actually wrapping and conforming to the shape. Now, it's still living in a block element, but what I'm doing is I'm defining a shape in CSS with a polygon and telling it I want it to stay within this context. So what I can do is I can copy some text and paste it in another element, and it'll continue to respect the shape that I've defined. So some of the interesting things we can do with this are create some fun little children's style books. There are a lot of really creative use cases for this, but you can see how the text actually stays within our shapes. And if I pan, this is a little game I put together. And as I pan around, you can see the story kind of follows the character as we roll through this little world. And it kind of shows how you can use, interactivity and all these other sort of great features we have in the web to make fun little reading experiences. Another interesting use case for this is in the concept of comic books. So in comic books, we often have a lot of imagery within our content right alongside copy. So here I have some text that's actually conforming to a shape, and it's avoiding the space shuttle that we have. But if you watch how the shape is actually wrapping around the space shuttle, what I can do because of media queries and because of the shapes defined in CSS, is I can actually zoom in and it changes the layout and the shape redefines itself based on my media query so that it still avoids the new layout. And I can zoom back out and have different layouts and it'll still avoid the shape. So that's just another interesting way that we can use exclusions combined with responsive techniques to do different kinds of layouts for our content. Something else that we're seeing as a trend on the web is this convergence of media. And I alluded to this a little bit when I was talking about that game where I had interactivity combined with a reading experience. Because we have access to things like WebGL, video, audio, and all these other great features on the web, we can add a lot of interactivity and a lot of extra elements to our reading experiences just to make them that much more engaging and valuable. So a great example of this is this snowfall article by the New York Times, where they actually use video. You can see we've got something that looks like a magazine layout, but it's actually video that's full screen as the cover. And as you scroll down, the video fades out, letting you focus on the content. while other elements and other videos that you can interact with fade in. And as we continue to go down, you can see how it doesn't completely distract you from the content, so you can still focus on reading, but it adds this extra flair and experience. So you can imagine how we can use things like video, WebGL, or even interactive infographics with SVG to really add a level of interactivity and engagement that we couldn't before. So really, what I want to get across with all of this is I think it would be great to see every kind of reading experience make its way to the web in a way that's native to the web platform. And we're really excited to see the kinds of experiences people are going to be creating with these new features. So if this is something you're excited about, let us know. We really want to work closely with the community to create useful tools and useful features on the web to make awesome reading experiences. So also check out html.adobe.com if you're interested in more about these features. And that's what I got. So do we have any questions? Okay. Well, thanks, guys. Oh, one?
Not so much. Hello? Not so much a question as a comment. I'm John. I do web accessibility for a living. You were talking about justification and how it can be distracting. It can be more than that. It can be really painful for people with cognitive disabilities or something like dyslexia, where the rivers of white actually overpower the words and they can't read any of the words.
Right.
So the recommendation is to avoid it whenever possible, just for what it's worth.
Okay, thanks. Cool. Thanks, guys.